Sometimes the best things in life come disguised as the worst possible timing. When Eleanor Briggs rode into Dry Mesa with nothing but the clothes on her back, she was running from a life that had crumbled like dust in her hands. Hank Rourke took one look at her and shook his head. "I've never hired a woman cowboy," he said, but his ranch was failing and his options were thin, so he gave her a chance. What happened next surprised them both. She could rope better than his best hands and work longer than men half her age. But what really caught Hank's attention wasn't her skill with cattle, it was the way she listened when he talked about dreams he'd buried years ago. What would it take for two wounded souls to find healing in each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun hadn't yet crested the mesa when Hank Rourke stepped onto his porch, coffee mug in hand, surveying the land that had been in his family for 3 generations. The rocking R ranch stretched out before him like a faded photographer's vibrant, now worn thin by drought and debt. At 62, Hank moved with the careful deliberation of a man who'd learned that rushing rarely solved anything, but his weathered hands still gripped his coffee cup with the strength that had once broken wild horses. His grandfather's branding iron hung beside the front door, its metal darkened by decades of use. That iron had marked thousands of cattle, each born a testament to the Rourke legacy. Now it served mostly as a reminder of better times, when the herds were thick and the banknotes were paid on time. "Morning, boss." Miguel Hernandez approached from the barn, his boots crunching on the dried grass. At 55, Miguel had worked the rocking R for nearly 20 years, arriving as a young vaquero and staying through Hank's marriage to Martha, her long illness, and the quiet grief that followed her death 3 years ago. His loyalty ran deeper than wages. It was the kind of bond forged by shared sunrise rides and midnight vigils with sick cattle. "How's that mare doing?" Hank asked, nodding toward the barn, where their prize breeding horse had been favoring her left leg. "Better. That new woman, she had a look at her yesterday evening. Said it wasn't the hoof like Doc Henderson thought, something about the way she was standing. Applied some kind of rap I'd never seen before." Miguel's weathered face creased with interest. "She's got away with horses, boss. Real gentle, but they listened to her." Eleanor Briggs. The name still felt foreign in Hank's thoughts. When she'd ridden up to his ranch 3 days ago, dust-covered and road-weary, he'd almost turned her away without a second glance. Women didn't work cattle ranches, not in his experience. But desperation had a way of broadening a man's perspective, and with half his crew gone to Colorado and bills stacking up like storm clouds, he'd found himself offering her a trial week. The decision had surprised him more than anyone. "She say where she learned that horse doctoring?" Hank asked. Miguel shrugged. "She don't say much about anything, but her hands know what they're doing. Yesterday she fixed that gate latch you and I been fighting with for a month. Took her maybe 10 minutes. They walked toward the barn together, their conversation easy with the familiarity of men who'd shared countless mornings like this one. The barn smelled of hay and leather, sweet feed and honest sweat scents that had comforted Hank since childhood. In the back stall, Elanor knelt beside the mare, her movements patient and sure. She looked up as they approached, her green eyes meeting Hank's briefly before returning to her work. Elanor was somewhere in her 40s, he guessed, with auburn hair that caught the morning light streaming through the barn windows. There was something in her bearing that spoke of education and refinement, though her hands were calloused and her boots were worn down to honest leather. "Morning," she said quietly, her voice carrying just a hint of an accent he couldn't quite place. "She's putting weight on it better today." Hank studied the mare's stance. Eleanor was right. The horse stood square now, no longer favoring the leg. What was it? Muscle strain in her shoulder. Sometimes what looks like a hoof problem starts higher up. Eleanor rose gracefully, brushing straw from her jeans. She should be fine for light work in a day or two. There it was again, that quiet competence that had caught his attention from the start. Most hired hands would have deferred to Doc Henderson's diagnosis, but Elanor had trusted her own judgment and been proven right. "Coffee's on up at the house," Hank found himself saying. "If you want some." Eleanor's surprise flickered across her features so briefly he might have imagined it. "Thank you, that's kind." They walked up to the main house together, Miguel peeling off toward the equipment barn with a knowing look that made Hank feel oddly self-conscious. The ranch house had been built by his grandfather in 1962, solid timber and stone that had weathered decades of prairie storms. Martha had loved this house, had filled it with laughter and the smell of fresh bread. Now it felt too quiet, too empty, like a church after the congregation has gone home. Eleanor paused at the threshold, her eyes taking in the living room with its stone fireplace and hand-hewn beams. On the mantel sat a photograph of Martha, at 30, her dark hair caught by wind, her smile bright with the joy of a woman who'd found her place in the world. "Your wife?" Eleanor asked softly. "Was. Cancer took her 3 years back." The words came easier now, though the ache remained. 28 years we had together. Eleanor nodded, understanding passing between them like a current. She didn't offer platitudes or empty comfort, just stood there for a moment, honoring Martha's memory with respectful silence. In the kitchen, Hank poured coffee from the pot he'd made at dawn. Eleanor accepted the mug with both hands, inhaling the steam with the appreciation of someone who'd known cold mornings and bitter coffee brewed over campfires. "This is good," she said, settling into one of the wooden chairs at his kitchen table. Through the window, they could see the mesa rising in the distance, its red stone catching the early light. "So where'd you learn to work cattle?" Hank asked, taking the seat across from her. Up close, he could see the fine lines around her eyes, the kind that came from years of squinting into sun and weather. Eleanor was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of carefully chosen words. "My father had a place in Wyoming. Small operation, but he believed in doing things right. Said, if you were going to work with animals, you had to understand them first." "Your father still ranching?" "No." She sipped her coffee, her gaze drifting toward the window. "He passed some years back. Place was sold." Hank recognized the deflection, the way she'd answered his question without really answering it. He'd done the same thing countless times when people asked about Martha's illness or his plans for the ranch. Some stories were too tender to share with strangers. "Miguel tells me you've got a good eye for what needs doing," he said instead. A small smile touched Eleanor's lips. "Miguel's been patient with the new hand. I appreciate that. He's good people. Been with me long enough to remember when this place actually made money." Hank's attempt at humor fell flat, the reality of his situation too heavy for jokes. Eleanor studied him over her coffee cup. "Hard times?" "Getting harder." The admission surprised him. He'd barely acknowledged the ranch's troubles to himself, let alone a stranger. But something about Eleanor invited honesty, maybe the way she listened, without judgment, or the quiet strength in her posture. "The bank's been understanding so far," he continued, the words coming despite his usual reserve. "But understanding only stretches so far." Eleanor set down her coffee cup, her fingers tracing its rim thoughtfully. "Sometimes a fresh perspective can help. I've seen operations turn around when they found the right approach." "And what approach would that be?" "Depends on the operation. But most struggling ranches I've seen are fighting the wrong battles. Trying to do everything the way it's always been done, even when the world's changed around them." Hank bristled slightly. "This ranch has been in my family for 3 generations. The methods we use are probably sound." Eleanor interrupted gently. "I'm not talking about throwing out everything that works. I'm talking about adaptation, finding new markets maybe, or diversifying income streams." Her words carried an authority that made Hank pause. This wasn't the casual wisdom of a drifting cowhand. This was someone who'd thought seriously about ranch economics. "You talk like someone who studied this," he said. Eleanor's expression closed off slightly. "I've seen a lot of ranches, worked a lot of different places." Another deflection, but Hank let it pass. Whatever Eleanor's background, she was here now, and her presence was already making a difference. Yesterday, she'd reorganized the feed storage system, creating better airflow to prevent spoilage. This morning, she'd diagnosed the mare's problem when an experienced veterinarian had missed it. Small things, perhaps, but they added up to efficiency, and efficiency meant survival. "Well," Hank said, rising to refill his coffee, "I reckon we'll see what fresh eyes can accomplish." Eleanor nodded, draining her cup and standing as well. "I should get started on those fence repairs in the south pasture. Take Miguel with you. Some of that wire's been up since my father's time. It can be temperamental." "Will do." She paused at the kitchen door, looking back at him. "Thank you for the coffee and for the chance." After she'd gone, Hank stood at his kitchen window, watching her walk toward the barn, her stride confident and purposeful. Dust motes danced in the morning light, streaming through the glass, and for a moment, the house didn't feel quite so empty. He found himself wondering about Eleanor Briggs, where she'd come from, what had brought her to his door, and why a woman with her obvious intelligence and skill was riding from ranch to ranch looking for work. But mostly, he wondered why her presence in his kitchen had felt so natural, like a missing piece sliding back into place. The photograph of Martha still smiled from the mantel, but for the first time in 3 years, Hank didn't feel like he was betraying her memory by noticing another woman's quiet grace. Outside, Miguel's voice carried on the morning air as he and Eleanor discussed the day's work, their conversation punctuated by the sound of horses moving in the corral. It was a good sound, the sound of a ranch coming alive with purpose. Hank poured himself another cup of coffee and stepped back onto his porch, watching Eleanor saddle her mare with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 10,000 times before. Whatever secrets she carried, whatever had brought her to the rocking hour, he was grateful she'd come, even if he wasn't quite ready to admit why. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by Tom Fletcher from the First National Bank of Cedar Springs. Hank knew what it contained before he opened it, the weight of the paper, the formal typeface visible through the window. Tom's apologetic expression as he handed it over said everything that needed saying. "I'm sorry, Hank," Tom said, his banker's composure cracking slightly. "Board's been pressuring me for months. I held them off as long as I could." Hank tore open the envelope with steady hands, though his heart hammered against his ribs. The words swam before his eyes. Notice of intent to foreclose. 90 days. Outstanding balance. 47,830. 2.16. Numbers that might as well have been a death sentence. 90 days, he said aloud, the words tasting like dust. "The board would consider a payment plan if you can show good faith," Tom offered, but they both knew it was hollow comfort. Good faith required money Hank didn't have, and prospects that looked dimmer with each passing month. After Tom drove away in his pristine sedan, Hank stood alone on his porch holding the notice. 3 generations of Rourke sweat and sacrifice reduced to legal terminology and a deadline. His grandfather had built this ranch with his bare hands and an unshakable belief in the future. His father had expanded it, weathering the agricultural crises of the 70s and 80s through sheer stubborn persistence. Now it would end with him. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made him look up. Elanor rode in from the south pasture, her mare picking its way carefully through the rocky ground near the house. She dismounted with fluid grace, looping the reins around the porch rail before she noticed his expression. "Bad news?" she asked quietly. Hank held up the notice, not trusting his voice. Eleanor read it quickly, her green eyes scanning the legal language with a familiarity that surprised him. 90 days, she said, echoing his earlier words. Not enough time. Hank sank into one of the wooden chairs on the porch, suddenly feeling every one of his 62 years. Even if I sold every head of cattle tomorrow, liquidated everything, it wouldn't be close to enough. Eleanor settled into the chair beside him, her presence somehow comforting without being intrusive. "Tell me about the debt. When did it start?" The question was personal, probably too personal to ask of a boss she'd known for less than a week. But something in Eleanor's tone invited honesty, the same quality that had led him to share coffee and conversation with her that first morning. "Martha's medical bills," he said simply. "Started small routine checkups, some tests the insurance didn't cover completely. Then came the diagnosis." The words came slowly at first, then in a rush that surprised him. He told Eleanor about the experimental treatments they'd tried, the specialists in Denver and Salt Lake City, the mounting costs that insurance deemed not medically necessary. He spoke of Martha's courage in the face of pain, her insistence that they try everything, spend everything, if it meant even a chance. She was worth every penny, he finished fiercely. I'd do it again tomorrow if it could bring her back. Eleanor nodded, understanding flickering in her eyes. Of course you would. Anyone who loved her would have done the same. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching dust devils dance across the dried pasture. Finally, Eleanor spoke. 47,000 isn't insurmountable, she said thoughtfully. For a property this size, with your water rights and mineral potential, there might be options. Mineral potential? Hank looked at her sharply. There's nothing under this ground but rock and clay. My grandfather had it surveyed back in the 60s. Surveys change. Technology improves. Sometimes what wasn't valuable 40 years ago becomes precious today. Eleanor's voice carried a certainty that made him pay attention. When was the last time anyone took a serious look at what's beneath your grazing land? Never saw the point. This is cattle country, not mining territory. Eleanor stood and walked to the porch railing, her gaze sweeping across the ranch with the intensity of someone seeing it through different eyes. The geological formations in this area have potential for rare earth deposits, the kind that are becoming more valuable every year. How do you know about rare earth deposits? Hank asked. But Eleanor was already moving, her mind clearly working through possibilities. We need to get a current geological survey, she said. Find out what's really under your land. It might not be anything, but if there's even a chance. Eleanor. Hank's voice stopped her mid-sentence. How does a ranch hand know about geological surveys and rare earth minerals? For a moment, she stood frozen, and Hank saw something flicker across her face. Fear, perhaps, or the look of someone who'd revealed more than intended. When she turned back to him, her expression was carefully neutral. I've worked a lot of different places, she said. You pick things up. It wasn't an answer, not really, but before Hank could press further, Miguel appeared around the corner of the house, his face grim. Boss, we got problems with the Hernandez boundary fence. Looks like cattle from the Double Diamond pushed through during the night. Some of ours might have wandered onto their property. The immediate crisis demanded attention, but as Hank followed Miguel toward the damaged fence, he found himself thinking about Eleanor's reaction to the foreclosure notice. There had been no shock in her expression, no surprise at the legal language or the stark realities of ranch finances. Instead, she'd read the document with the familiarity of someone who'd seen such notices before. The fence repair took most of the afternoon, complicated by the need to round up strayed cattle and negotiate with Frank Morrison from the Double Diamond about property boundaries. By the time Hank returned to the house, exhaustion weighed on his shoulders like a physical burden. Eleanor was waiting on the porch, a manila folder in her hands. I drove into town, she said without preamble. Sarah Jenkins at the general store let me use her computer. I did some research on geological surveys in this area. She handed him the folder, filled with printed pages covered in technical language and geological maps. Hank recognized his property boundaries outlined in red ink. According to the State Geological Service, there's been increased interest in rare earth deposits throughout this region. Eleanor continued, 3 surveys conducted in the past 5 years, all showing positive indicators for valuable mineral deposits. Hank studied the maps, trying to make sense of the technical terminology. What kind of indicators? The kind that major mining companies pay serious money to explore. Eleanor's voice carried excitement now, the careful reserve she usually maintained slipping away. Hank, if even a fraction of this property contains extractable deposits, you could be looking at enough money to not only save the ranch, but expand it. And if it doesn't? Eleanor's enthusiasm dimmed slightly. Then we find another solution, but this is hope, real hope, where there wasn't any this morning. Hank looked at the foreclosure notice, still lying on the table where he'd dropped it hours earlier, then at the geological surveys in his hands. 90 days, to save everything his family had built. Yesterday, that had seemed impossible. Now, how do we find out for sure? He asked. Eleanor's smile was the first completely unguarded expression he'd seen from her. We call a geological surveyor, get them out here to take core samples and run proper tests. It'll cost some money up front, but I don't have money for surveys, Hank interrupted. What I've got is enough to keep the lights on for maybe 2 months. I could cover the survey costs, Eleanor said quietly. Consider it an investment in the ranch. Hank stared at her. You'd do that? For a place you've worked at for less than a week? Eleanor looked away, her walls going back up. I believe in taking calculated risks. This feels like a good one. There it was, again the sense that Eleanor Briggs was far more than she appeared to be. Ranch hands didn't casually offer to fund geological surveys. They didn't speak with authority about rare earth minerals or read foreclosure notices with the familiarity of someone who'd handled such documents before. But as the sun set over the mesa, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Hank found he didn't care about Eleanor's secrets. What mattered was the hope she'd brought to his darkest day, the possibility that the rocking R might survive after all. All right, he said finally. Make the call. Eleanor nodded, her relief visible. I'll contact a surveyor first thing tomorrow. As she gathered the geological reports and headed toward the bunkhouse where she'd been staying, Hank called after her. Eleanor, thank you for all of this. She paused at the bottom of the porch steps, looking back at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Don't thank me yet, she said softly. Let's see what we find under your ground first. That night, Hank lay awake staring at the ceiling, the foreclosure notice, and Eleanor's geological surveys competing for space in his thoughts. Somewhere between the fear of losing everything and the fragile hope of salvation, he found himself wondering who Eleanor Briggs really was and what had brought someone with her knowledge and resources to his struggling ranch. But those were questions for another day. Tonight, for the first time in months, the future held possibilities beyond failure and loss. And that was enough. The geological surveyor arrived at dawn 3 days later, driving a truck loaded with equipment that looked more suited to space exploration than ranch work. Dr. Patricia Wells was a compact woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent decades extracting truth from reluctant earth. Eleanor met her at the gate, and Hank watched from the porch as they shook hands like old acquaintances. Their conversation was too distant to hear, but Eleanor's body language suggested familiarity with the technical aspects of Dr. Wells' work. She knows what she's talking about, Eleanor said when she and Dr. Wells reached the house. The preliminary surveys I showed you were accurate. There's definitely potential here. Dr. Wells nodded briskly. Based on the geological formations and the regional surveys, I'd say we're looking at a 70% probability of commercially viable deposits. Won't know the extent until we start drilling core samples. Over the next 2 days, Dr. Wells and her assistant methodically worked across the ranch, their drilling equipment leaving precise holes in the earth, like surgical incisions. Eleanor shadowed their work with an intensity that surprised Hank, asking questions that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of geological processes. Meanwhile, Hank found himself watching Eleanor as much as the survey work. Small details began adding up to a picture that didn't quite fit the story of a drifting ranch hand. Her boots, while worn, were expensive hand-tooled leather that spoke of serious money. Her saddle was similarly high-end, the kind of gear that cost more than most cowboys made in 6 months. More telling were the moments when she forgot to guard her words. Discussing pasture rotation with Miguel, she'd referenced techniques used on large-scale operations with specific acreage numbers that suggested personal experience. When Dr. Wells mentioned mineral rights legislation, Eleanor had corrected a technical detail with the precision of someone who'd navigated such laws before. On the second evening of the survey, Hank found Eleanor sitting alone by the corral, her dinner barely touched on the plate beside her. She was staring at a photographer, small, faded image she held carefully between her fingers. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. Eleanor startled slightly, quickly tucking the photograph into her shirt pocket. Of course. Hank settled on the fence rail beside her, noting the way she'd wiped her eyes before he'd approached. Survey going well? Dr. Wells thinks so. We should have preliminary results tomorrow. Eleanor's voice carried a forced cheerfulness that didn't reach her eyes. That's good news. Hank paused, choosing his words carefully. You've been working hard on this, above and beyond what any hired hand would do. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. Sometimes a place just feels worth fighting for, even a place you've known for less than 2 weeks. Especially then. Eleanor turned to look at him, and in the fading light, Hank saw something raw and vulnerable in her expression. When you've lost everything that mattered, you learn to recognize what's worth protecting. The admission hung between them like a bridge. Neither was quite ready to cross. Hank sensed that Eleanor had revealed more than she'd intended, but before he could respond, she was standing, gathering her plate. I should turn in early, she said. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. That night, Hank found himself thinking about the photograph Eleanor had hidden so quickly. The glimpse he'd caught had shown a young girl, maybe 10 years old, with Eleanor's green eyes and a gap-toothed smile. A daughter, perhaps, though Eleanor had never mentioned children. The next morning brought Dr. Wells' preliminary findings, delivered with the clinical precision of a medical diagnosis. You're sitting on a significant deposit, she announced, spreading core samples across Hank's kitchen table. Rare earth elements, primarily neodymium and dysprosium. Conservative estimate puts the value at somewhere between $8 and $12 million. Hank felt the floor shift beneath him. Million, Dr. Wells confirmed. These elements are crucial for renewable energy technology, wind turbines, electric vehicle batteries, solar panels. Demand is only going to increase. Eleanor leaned forward, studying the samples with the focused attention she brought to everything. What about extraction costs? That's where it gets interesting, Dr. Wells said. The deposits are relatively shallow and concentrated. Extraction would be simpler and less environmentally disruptive than most rare earth operations. You're looking at maybe 3 to 4 million in development costs to start production. Hank's mind reeled with the numbers. $8 million. Even after extraction costs and taxes, it would be enough to save the ranch, expand operations, and secure the Rourke legacy for another generation. How long before we know for certain? He asked. I'll need 2 more days for comprehensive testing, then a week to compile the full report. But Mr. Rourke, Dr. Wells fixed him with a steady gaze. You should start thinking about what you want to do with this information. Word has a way of getting out about discoveries like this. After Dr. Wells left to continue her testing, Hank and Eleanor walked the property boundaries, ostensibly checking fence lines, but really processing the magnitude of the morning's revelation. It doesn't feel real, Hank said, kicking at a clump of dried grass. This morning I was facing foreclosure. Now I'm talking about millions of dollars buried under dirt I've walked on for 60 years. It's real, Eleanor said quietly. The question is what you do with it. What do you mean? Eleanor stopped walking, her expression serious. Discoveries like this attract attention, Hank. Mining companies, investors, people who might try to pressure you into deals that aren't in your best interest. You need to be careful who you trust. I trust you, Hank said, the words coming before he'd fully thought them through. Eleanor's step faltered slightly. You shouldn't, not until you know more about me. Then tell me more. Hank stopped too, facing her directly. Where did you really come from, Eleanor? How does a woman with your education and obvious experience end up riding from ranch to ranch looking for work? For a moment, he thought she might answer. Her walls seemed to waver, and he caught a glimpse of something pain, perhaps, or a longing to share the burden she'd been carrying alone. But then Miguel's voice carried across the pasture, calling for help with a calf that had gotten tangled in fence wire, and the moment passed. We should help Miguel, Eleanor said, already moving toward the sound of his voice. The crisis with the calf took the rest of the morning, The young animal had panicked and wrapped wire around its legs in a way that required careful cutting to avoid injury. Elanor worked with steady hands and quiet words, calming the frightened animal, while Hank and Miguel cut it free. Watching her gentle competence with the calf, Hank found himself remembering the hidden photograph, the daughter with Eleanor's eyes. Whatever had happened to separate Elanor from her past, it had left her with a tenderness toward vulnerable things that spoke of deep loss. That afternoon, while Elanor worked with Miguel to repair the damaged fence, Hank found himself on the porch with Martha's photograph in his hands. His wife smiled back at him from the frame, eternally young and radiant. "What do you think, darling?" he asked the photograph, his voice barely a whisper. "Am I betraying your memory by caring about another woman?" The photograph, of course, offered no answer. But sitting there in the afternoon sun, Hank realized that his feelings for Elanor weren't about replacing Martha or forgetting their life together. They were about the possibility of healing, of finding companionship in the years that remained to him. For the first time since Martha's death, the house didn't feel like a monument to the past, but a place where the future might take root. Whether Elanor would be part of that future remained to be seen. But as he watched her work in the distance, her auburn hair catching the sunlight, Hank found himself hoping she would be. The guilt hit Hank hardest in the quiet moments, when he caught himself looking forward to Eleanor's morning coffee visits, or when he found excuses to work alongside her in the barn. Martha's wedding ring still circled his finger, a constant reminder of promises made and kept for 28 years. Yet here he was, a widower of 3 years, feeling his heart stir for another woman. Standing at his bedroom window before dawn, Hank twisted the gold band around his finger and watched Elanor emerge from the bunkhouse. Even in the grey, pre-dawn light, her movements carried a grace that drew his eye. She'd developed a routine over the past 2 weeks, early rising, a quiet check on the horses, then coffee brewing by the time he appeared on the porch. This morning was different. Dr. Wells would deliver her final geological report, and depending on what it contained, everything about the Rocking R's future would change. "Morning," Eleanor said when he joined her in the kitchen. She handed him a steaming mug, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. The contact sent a warmth up his arm that had nothing to do with the coffee. "You sleep at all?" he asked, noting the shadows under her eyes. "Some." Eleanor settled into her usual chair, cradling her mug like a prayer, thinking about what comes next. Before Hank could ask what she meant, the sound of an approaching vehicle announced Dr. Wells's arrival. The geologist entered with the brisk efficiency that marked all her interactions, carrying a thick folder that would determine the ranch's fate. "The news is excellent," she began without preamble, spreading maps and charts across the kitchen table. "The deposits are even more extensive than preliminary tests indicated. Conservative valuation puts this at $12 million, with potential for $15 million if global demand continues to increase." Hank stared at the numbers, trying to comprehend a sum that dwarfed everything he'd ever imagined. Beside him, Elanor leaned forward, studying the technical data with an intensity that again suggested familiarity with such reports. "Time frame for development?" Elanor asked. "With proper permitting and environmental clearances, you could see initial extraction within 18 months. Production revenue within 2 years. Dr. Wells gathered her materials efficiently. "My recommendation is that you engage a mineral rights attorney immediately. Word about discoveries like this travels fast, and you'll want legal protection before the mining companies start making approaches." After Dr. Wells departed, Hank and Eleanor sat in the kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of their transformed future geological surveys, mineral assay reports, and a formal document declaring the Rocking R Ranch worth more than most small towns. $12 million, Hank said, tasting the words like unfamiliar wine. "Enough to save the ranch 10 times over," Eleanor replied, but her tone carried something that sounded almost like regret. "You don't sound happy about it." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the mesa visible through the kitchen window. Change isn't always comfortable, even when it's necessary. That afternoon, they rode out to check the cattle in the north pasture, ostensibly for routine ranch work, but really to escape the weight of decisions that lay ahead. The rhythm of their horses moving together felt natural now, like a conversation conducted in the language of shared work and quiet companionship. "Tell me about your wife," Eleanor said as they paused to watch the herd graze in the afternoon sun. The request surprised Hank. Eleanor rarely asked personal questions, preferring to learn about people through observation rather than inquiry. Martha was. Hank searched for words that could capture 28 years of marriage. She was the kind of woman who made everything better just by being there. Laughed easily, loved deeply, believed the best of everyone she met. "She sounds wonderful." She was. Smart as a whip, two-handled the ranch's books, managed our investments, kept me from making more stupid decisions than I actually made. Hank's smile held equal parts, love and loss. She would have figured out the mineral rights situation weeks ago. Maybe. Or maybe she would have trusted someone else to help with that. Eleanor's voice carried a gentle suggestion that made Hank look at her sharply. "You think Martha would have approved of you being here?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. "I think Martha would have wanted you to be happy, and I think she would have recognized that happiness sometimes comes in unexpected forms." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pasture. When they reached the creek that marked the northern boundary, Eleanor dismounted to check the water level, another of those small competencies that marked her as far more experienced than she claimed. "The water's good," she called, kneeling by the creek bank. "Flows stronger than I expected for this time of year." Hank dismounted and joined her, studying the clear water running over smooth stones. This creek had been a constant in his life, source of water for cattle, a cool retreat during summer work, the place where he'd first kissed Martha on a hot July evening 40 years ago. "You know what the strangest part of all this is?" he said, settling on a fallen log beside the water. "What's that?" "A month ago, I was facing the end of everything. Today, I'm richer than I ever dreamed possible. But what I keep thinking about is how none of it would have happened if you hadn't ridden up to my door." Eleanor joined him on the log, her shoulder nearly touching his. "You would have found another way. Men like you always do." "Men like me?" "Men who don't give up, who honor their obligations and protect what they love." Eleanor's voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Your wife was lucky to have you. I was the lucky one." They sat listening to the creek's gentle murmur, the sound mixing with the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through dry grass. The moment felt suspended, as if the world had paused to let them catch their breath before the future rushed in with all its complications. "Eleanor," Hank said finally, "when all this mineral rights business gets sorted out, when the ranch is secure, what will you do then?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap, and Hank noticed she wore no rings, no jewelry of any kind, except for a thin gold chain that disappeared beneath her shirt collar. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've been moving for so long. I'm not sure I remember how to stay anywhere. Maybe it's time to learn." Eleanor turned to look at him, and for a moment, the careful distance she maintained seemed to dissolve. Her green eyes held depths of longing and fear, hope and regret, all tangled together in a complexity that spoke of profound loss. "Hank," whatever she might have said was interrupted by the sound of Miguel calling from across the pasture. One of the bulls had gotten through a fence and was making trouble with a neighbor's herd. Ranch emergencies waited for no one, not even moments that might change everything. As they rode back toward the house, Hank found himself thinking about Martha's ring, still circling his finger after 3 years of widowhood. For the first time since her death, he wondered if the time had come to take it off, not as a rejection of their love, but as an acceptance that love could take more than one form in a lifetime. But that was a decision for another day. Today had brought enough revelations for any man to process. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own possibilities. Tonight, he would simply be grateful for the unexpected gift of hope and for the mysterious woman who had delivered it to his door. The land surveyor's map lay spread across Hank's kitchen table like a treasure chart, its precise lines and careful measurements revealing secrets the Earth had kept for millennia. Red ink marked the boundaries of the rocking R, while blue shading indicated the extent of the rare earth deposits beneath an underground fortune that stretched across nearly 2/3 of his property. Eleanor traced the mineral boundaries with her finger, her expression thoughtful. "The deposits follow the old creek bed," she observed. "Your great-grandfather chose this land well, even if he didn't know why." "Pure luck," Hank said, though he found himself wondering if luck was really the right word. 3 generations of Rourkes had worked this land, loved it, fought for it. Maybe the earth had simply been waiting for the right moment to reveal its gifts. "Not luck," Eleanor corrected quietly. "Vision, the kind of long-term thinking that builds legacies." Her words carried a weight that made Hank study her profile as she bent over the map. More and more, Eleanor's casual observations revealed depths of knowledge that didn't fit her cover story of a drifting ranch hand. She spoke of legacies with the authority of someone who'd built them, of long-term thinking with the precision of someone who'd planned in decades rather than seasons. The sound of vehicles approaching interrupted his thoughts. Through the kitchen window, Hank saw 2 black SUVs with tinted windows pulling up to his house, the kind of corporate transportation that had no business on a working ranch. "Expecting company?" Eleanor asked, but her tone suggested she already knew the answer. The visitors introduced themselves with the polished efficiency of people accustomed to getting what they wanted. James Morrison, from Consolidated Mining Solutions, Patricia Chen from Western Rare Earth Development, and a third man who simply offered his card, without explanation, Thomas Wright, attorney at law. "Word travels fast in the mining community," Morrison explained as they settled in Hank's living room. "We understand you've made a significant discovery." Eleanor had positioned herself near the kitchen doorway, close enough to hear but maintaining the distance appropriate for a hired hand. Hank noticed how she'd angled herself to keep both the visitors and the rear exit in her line of sight, a precaution that seemed oddly professional. "We're prepared to make you a very generous offer," Chen continued, sliding a leather portfolio across the coffee table. $8 million for full mineral rights to your property, cash payment, no development risks, immediate transfer. Hank opened the portfolio and stared at numbers that would have solved every financial problem he'd ever had. $8 million more money than his family had seen in 3 generations of ranching. "That's less than the deposits are worth," Eleanor said quietly from the doorway. Morrison turned to look at her, his expression cooling slightly. "I'm sorry, miss?" "Briggs," Eleanor supplied, her voice level, "and the geological surveys indicate a conservative value of 12 million, with potential for 15. Chen's smile became more forced. "Surveys can be optimistic. There are extraction costs, environmental permits, market fluctuations to consider. Our offer accounts for those risks." "Your offer accounts for a 30% profit margin," Eleanor replied calmly. "Standard industry practice for low-risk extraction operations." The room went quiet. Morrison and Chen exchanged glances that spoke of calculations being rapidly revised. Wright, the attorney, leaned forward with the focused attention of a predator scenting opportunity. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately," Morrison suggested, his tone carefully neutral. "Ranch business is typically handled between principals." "Miss Briggs has been instrumental in this discovery," Hank said firmly. "Anything you want to say, you can say in front of her." More glances between the visitors. Chen opened a second portfolio, revealing a new set of documents. $10 million, she said. "Final offer. But it's contingent on immediate acceptance. This offer expires in 72 hours. Eleanor moved from the doorway to stand behind Hank's chair, her presence somehow reassuring. "Why the time pressure?" she asked. Wright spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to legal maneuvering. "Market conditions are volatile. Rare earth prices fluctuate based on international trade policies. A delay could affect valuation significantly." "Or," Eleanor said with deceptive mildness, Word is getting out about the discovery, and you want to secure the rights before other companies start making competitive offers." The visitor's expressions confirmed Eleanor's assessment more clearly than words could have. Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, while Chen's smile became genuinely cold. "We're offering fair market value," Morrison said. "More than fair, considering the risks inherent in any mining operation." "What risks?" Hank asked. "Environmental complications," Wright enumerated. "Permitting delays, community opposition, market downturns, any number of factors could reduce the profitability of extraction." Eleanor moved to the window, gazing out at the ranch with an expression Hank couldn't quite read. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority that made everyone in the room pay attention. "Gentlemen, you're talking to a man whose family has worked this land for 3 generations. He understands risk better than most. He also understands the difference between fair offers and predatory ones." Chen stood abruptly, her professional composure cracking slightly. "I think we've covered everything we need to discuss. Mr. Rourke, you have our offer. We'll need an answer by Friday." After the visitors departed, leaving behind leather portfolios and business cards that smelled of expensive cologne, Hank and Eleanor stood on the porch watching the SUVs disappear down the ranch road. $10 million, Hank said slowly. 40% below market value, Eleanor replied. "And that's assuming conservative estimates. With proper negotiation and competitive bidding, you could probably get 15 million or more." Hank turned to study Eleanor's profile. "You handled that like someone who's been in similar negotiations before." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the distant mesa. "I've seen how these companies operate. They count on people being overwhelmed by large numbers, pressured by artificial deadlines. And how exactly have you seen how these companies operate?" Before Eleanor could answer, Miguel appeared around the corner of the house, his expression troubled. "Boss, we need to talk," he said. "Had a visitor while you were meeting with those city folks. Man asking questions about the woman who's been working here." Eleanor went very still beside him. "What kind of questions?" "Wanted to know how long you'd been here, where you came from before. Said he was thinking of hiring you for his operation." Miguel's weathered face creased with concern. "But he didn't ask like someone looking to hire ranch help. Asked like someone looking to find someone who didn't want to be found." The color drained from Eleanor's face. For a moment, she looked like she might flee, actually run, right there and then. But then her shoulders squared, and the mask of careful composure slid back into place. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "Told him you were a good worker who minded your own business," Miguel said. "Figured that was true enough without being helpful." Eleanor nodded, but Hank could see the tension in her posture, the way her eyes kept scanning the horizon, as if expecting unwelcome visitors. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "what kind of trouble are you running from?" She looked at him then, and for a moment, her carefully maintained walls crumbled completely. He saw fear there, and regret, and something that looked like desperate longing. "The kind that follows you wherever you go," she said softly. "The kind that ruins everything good you try to build." Before he could respond, she was walking away, her stride quick and purposeful as she headed toward the barn. Hank watched her go, understanding with sudden clarity that the mineral discovery, significant as it was, might be the least complicated challenge facing the Rocking R Ranch. That evening found Eleanor in the barn, methodically cleaning tack that didn't need cleaning. Hank watched her from the doorway, noting the precise, repetitive motions that spoke of a mind seeking refuge in familiar work. In the lamplight, he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing toward the barn door, as if expecting unwelcome visitors. "Planning to wear holes in that leather?" he asked, gently. Eleanor's hands stilled on the bridle she'd been oiling for the 3rd time. "Habit, I suppose. When I'm thinking, I work with my hands." Hank entered the barn, settling on a hay bale across from where she sat. The space between them felt charged with unspoken questions and carefully guarded answers. "Want to talk about what you're thinking so hard about?" he asked. Eleanor set down the bridle, her movements deliberate and slow. "I've been thinking I should move on. Tomorrow." Maybe. Or tonight. The words hit Hank like a physical blow, though he tried not to let it show. Because of whoever was asking questions? Because I bring complications wherever I go. Eleanor's voice was steady, but Hank could hear the pain beneath the controlled surface. You've got enough to deal with without my problems adding to the mix. What if I don't want you to go? Eleanor looked up at him then, and in her green eyes he saw a war between hope and fear. Hank. I mean it. The words came easier than he'd expected, carrying the weight of feelings he'd been afraid to acknowledge. These past few weeks, you've become part of this place. Part of, he paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound presumptuous. Part of what makes it feel like home again. Eleanor's breath caught, and for a moment, the careful distance she maintained seemed to waver. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. Hank leaned forward, his voice growing more certain with each word. I know that you saved this ranch. I know that you work harder than any 3 hands I've ever hired. I know that when you smile, really smile, not that polite thing you do for strangers, it lights up this whole place. Hank, stop. Eleanor stood abruptly, moving to the barn window that looked out over the darkening pasture. You don't understand. My past the people looking for Mace, not just some misunderstanding that can be cleared up with explanations. Then help me understand. Eleanor was quiet for so long that Hank thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Have you ever lost someone you loved so completely that it felt like part of your soul had been torn away? Martha, Hank said simply. Then you know. Eleanor's reflection in the window showed tears she was fighting to hold back. But Martha died of illness, natural causes. Tragic, but not. She stopped, pressing her palms against the window frame. Not what? Not because of choices you made. Mistakes that could have been avoided if you'd been smarter, or braver, or just different. Hank rose and crossed to stand behind her, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to trap her. Eleanor, what happened? For a moment, he thought she might tell him. Her shoulders trembled with the weight of whatever she carried, and her reflection in the window showed a woman on the edge of breaking. But then headlights swept across the yard outside, and Eleanor stepped back from the window with a sharp intake of breath. More visitors, Hank observed, recognizing the expensive sedan that had no more business on his ranch than the morning's SUVs. 2 men emerged from the carolder, distinguished, wearing suits that probably cost more than most ranches made in a month. Even from the barn, Hank could see the family resemblance in their bearing, the way they moved with the confidence of people accustomed to having their wishes treated as commands. Eleanor Catherine Witmore, the older of the 2, called toward the barn, his voice carrying the authority of someone who expected immediate compliance. We know you're here. It's time to come home. Eleanor went absolutely still beside him. Witmore? Hank asked quietly. My maiden name, she whispered. My father-in-law and brother-in-law. I haven't seen them since the funeral. The men approached the barn with measured steps, their expensive shoes incongruous on the straw-covered ground. The older man, clearly the patriarch of whatever family dynasty they represented, spoke with the measured cadence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Eleanor, enough of this nonsense. You've had your time to grieve, to process, but responsibilities await. The estate requires attention, and Sophia's trust fund needs proper management. At the mention of the name Sophia, Eleanor made a small, wounded sound that cut straight through Hank's heart. Hello, Edward, Charles. Eleanor's voice was steady now, but Hank could see her hands trembling. I told you at the funeral, I want nothing to do with the estate. What you want ceased to be relevant when you abandoned your responsibilities. Charles Witmore replied coldly. Sophia's inheritance is substantial. It requires oversight from someone who understands the family's interests. Sophia is dead, Eleanor said, each word precisely enunciated. Your son is dead. What you're really talking about is money. Edward Witmore's expression softened slightly, revealing something that might have been genuine grief beneath the corporate demeanor. Eleanor, we love them too. David was our son, Sophia our granddaughter. But running away, hiding on some godforsaken ranch, this isn't what they would have wanted. You have no idea what they would have wanted. We know they wouldn't have wanted their family torn apart by tragedy. Charles stepped forward, his tone becoming more aggressive. We know they wouldn't have wanted their daughter's inheritance managed by a woman who's clearly having some kind of breakdown. Hank stepped into the light then, positioning himself beside Eleanor in a gesture that was unmistakably protective. I think the lady's made her position clear, gentlemen. The Witmores turned their attention to him with the dismissive assessment wealthy people reserved for obstacles that could be purchased or removed. "And you are?" Edward asked. "Hank Rourke. This is my ranch." "Ah." Charles smiled without warmth. "The employer who's been harboring our wayward family member. I assume Elanor has been forthcoming about her background, her responsibilities." "Eleanor's business is her own," Hank replied evenly. "Just like her decisions about where she wants to be." "I'm afraid it's not that simple," Edward said. "Elanor is the trustee of a substantial estate. There are legal obligations that can't be abandoned simply because one wishes to play cowgirl." Eleanor stepped forward, her composure returning as she faced the two men. "I resigned as trustee. The paperwork was filed with the court 6 months ago. Paperwork that was rejected due to procedural irregularities." Charles countered smoothly. "The court requires a formal hearing to approve the resignation of a trustee when substantial assets are involved. That hearing is scheduled for next month." The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Legal obligations that couldn't be ignored, family money that came with chains, and the implicit threat that failure to comply would result in consequences Eleanor clearly feared. "1 month," she said quietly. "1 month," Edward confirmed. "After which, if you continue to refuse your responsibilities, the court will appoint an alternative trustee, someone who will ensure Sophia's legacy is properly managed." After the Witmores departed, Eleanor sat heavily on a hay bale, looking suddenly fragile in the harsh barn light. "Eleanor Witmore," Hank said gently, "not Briggs." "Eleanor Catherine Witmore Bishop," she corrected. "Widow of David Bishop, mother of Sophia Bishop, trustee of an estate worth approximately $40 million. The numbers hung in the air like an accusation. $40 million enough money to save 1,000 struggling ranches, to buy and sell entire towns. "And you've been working as a ranch hand," Hank said, not quite a question. "Because it was the only place I could find peace," Eleanor replied. "The only place where I could just be Eleanor. Not the grieving widow or the wealthy heiress or the woman who—" She stopped, but Hank could fill in the rest. "The woman who blamed herself for whatever tragedy had taken her family." "1 month," she said again, and this time it sounded like a death sentence. Eleanor's real identity documents lay spread across Hank's kitchen table like fragments of a life deliberately shattered and carefully hidden. Driver's licenses, bank statements, legal papers, each one bearing the name Eleanor Catherine Witmore Bishop, and addresses that spoke of a world far removed from dusty ranch work and early morning cattle calls. $40 million, Hank said, the number still hard to comprehend even after hearing it twice. Eleanor sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had long since gone cold. In the harsh light of full disclosure, she looked smaller somehow, as if maintaining her secrets had required a strength that was now depleted. "The Witmore Cattle Company," she said quietly, "founded by my great-grandfather in 1923, started with 1,000 acres in Wyoming and grew from there. By the time my father inherited it, we owned ranches in 6 states and processing facilities across the West. My father had no sons. I was groomed from childhood to take over the operation." Eleanor's voice carried the weight of obligations she'd never chosen. Business degree from Wharton, MBA from Stanford, internships at every level of the company from ranch hand to board member. Hank tried to reconcile this information with the woman who'd spent the past month fixing his fences and doctoring his cattle. "So you actually do know about ranch operations?" "I know about ranch operations the way a surgeon knows about anatomy, technically proficient, but missing the soul of it." Eleanor looked up at him, her green eyes reflecting pain, that had nothing to do with business school or family obligations. Until I came here, I'd never worked a ranch just for the love of the work itself. What happened to change that? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting to the window where the first light of dawn was beginning to touch the mesa. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I met David at a cattle industry conference in Denver. He was a veterinarian, working with small ranchers who couldn't afford the big animal hospitals. Kind, idealistic, passionate about helping people who reminded him of his own family's farming background. She paused, lost in memories that were clearly both precious and painful. We married 2 years later. Sophia came along 3 years after that, a beautiful little girl with his sense of humor and my stubborn streak. For 8 years, we had something close to perfect. What happened? Eleanor's hands tightened around the coffee mug. David wanted to expand his practice, open a clinic that could serve the smaller ranchers across 3 counties. It was his dream affordable veterinary care for people who loved their animals but couldn't always afford the best treatment. Hank waited, sensing that the heart of Eleanor's story was approaching. The clinic required significant investment equipment, staff, building modifications. David was reluctant to use family money, said he wanted to build something with his own hands. But I pushed for it. Eleanor's voice became strained. I convinced him that the Witmore money could do real good, help people who needed it. That sounds like a worthy goal. It was. But wealthy families like mine don't just give money away without expectations. My father and the board of directors wanted oversight, input into how the clinic operated. They wanted to expand it into a regional chain, turn David's idealistic dream into another Witmore business venture. Eleanor stood abruptly, moving to the window, as if the conversation required distance from the documents that proved her deception. David fought them for 2 years, tried to maintain his independence while taking their money. The stress was enormous: board meetings, quarterly reports, pressure to show profit margins on a practice that was meant to serve people who couldn't afford to pay full price. And Sophia? Sophia was 8, old enough to sense the tension between her parents, young enough to think she could fix it. Eleanor's voice broke slightly. She started having nightmares, anxiety about school, worry that Daddy and Mommy were going to get divorced like her friends' parents. Hank felt a cold understanding beginning to form. Eleanor. We were driving back from a family therapy session in Denver. It was late, snowing, and we were all exhausted from another attempt to explain to an 8-year-old why her parents spent so much time arguing about things she didn't understand. Eleanor's reflection in the window showed tears. She was no longer trying to hide. David was driving. I was in the passenger seat reviewing clinic financial reports that the board wanted by morning. Sophia was in the back seat, asleep. The kitchen was absolutely quiet, except for the soft ticking of the wall clock and the distant sound of cattle moving in the pasture. The other driver ran a red light, hit us on David's side of the car. Eleanor's voice became mechanical, clinical, as if the only way to tell the story was to strip it of all emotion. David died instantly. Sophia lived for 3 days in the ICU before her injuries. She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Hank crossed to stand behind her, not touching but close enough to offer the comfort of presence. It wasn't your fault. Wasn't it? Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes blazing with a grief that had clearly been poisoning her for years. If I hadn't pushed David to take the family money, he wouldn't have been under such stress. If I hadn't insisted he attend that board meeting in Denver, we wouldn't have been on that road. If I hadn't been so focused on quarterly reports that I couldn't even talk to my own daughter during the drive. Eleanor, stop. Hank's voice was firm. A drunk driver ran a red light. That's what killed your family, not business decisions or board meetings or quarterly reports. The Witmores don't see it that way. They think grief has made me unstable, unfit to manage Sophia's trust fund. They want to take control of her inheritance, use it to expand the business empire she'll never live to inherit. And you won't let them. I can't let them. Eleanor's voice carried desperate determination. Sophia's money was meant to help people. David's clinic, educational programs for rural children, support for small ranchers. If the Witmores get control, it becomes just another profit center. Hank studied Eleanor's face, seeing her clearly for the first time. Not the mysterious drifter who'd appeared at his ranch, not the competent ranch hand who'd saved his operation, but a woman who'd lost everything that mattered and was fighting to honor her family's memory in the only way she knew how. So, you ran. I resigned from everything: the company board, the trust, every legal obligation I could escape. Changed my name back to my maiden name, liquidated my personal assets, and started moving from ranch to ranch. Eleanor's smile was bitter, trying to find some version of the life David and I might have had if we'd never gotten involved with family money. And found yourself here. And found myself here. Eleanor looked around the kitchen that had become so familiar over the past month. The first place in 2 years where I felt like I could breathe again. Hank reached out tentatively, covering her hand with his. Then stay. You don't understand. The hearing is in 1 month. If I don't appear, the court will appoint the Witmores as trustees by default. $40 million will become their plaything, and every dream David had about helping people will disappear into corporate profit margins. So don't let that happen. Eleanor stared at him. What? Go to the hearing, fight them, honor your family's memory by making sure Sophia's inheritance does what you and David intended. I can't. Eleanor's voice was small, defeated. I tried fighting them before. They have lawyers, political connections, business relationships that go back generations. I'm just one grieving woman who hasn't been able to function normally since she lost her family. No, Hank said firmly. You're Eleanor Catherine Witmore Bishop. You have a Wharton business degree and an MBA from Stanford. You've been groomed since childhood to handle family business. And for the past month, you've shown me exactly what you're capable of when you put your mind to something. Eleanor looked at him with something that might have been hope. You really think I could win? I think you're the only one who can win. But Eleanor, Hank paused, knowing his next words would either strengthen or destroy whatever fragile connection they'd built. If you go back to fight this battle, you'll be returning to a world that has 40 million reasons to keep you there. What happens to us then? The question hung between them, heavy with implications about futures neither had dared to imagine before this moment. The letter lay on Hank's desk like a declaration of war, written in his careful script but never delivered. 3 pages of thoughts he'd struggled to put into words, feelings that had grown from respect to something deeper over the weeks Eleanor had been at the ranch. A marriage proposal that might never be read. Eleanor, it began, I'm not a man who speaks easily about matters of the heart. Martha used to say I could talk for hours about cattle prices or weather patterns, but stumble over simple words like, I love you. She was right then, and I'm afraid she'd be right now. Hank folded the letter carefully, slipping it into his shirt pocket as he headed toward the barn, where Eleanor was packing her few belongings. 3 days had passed since the Witmores' visit, 3 days of careful preparation for a battle that would determine not only Sophia's legacy, but Eleanor's future, and by extension, his own. You don't have to leave tonight, he said, finding her methodically rolling her spare clothes into a travel bag that looked as worn and practical as everything else she owned. The hearing is in 2 weeks. I need time to prepare, find legal representation, gather documents. Eleanor's voice was steady, but Hank could see the tension in her shoulders. The way her hands moved with the precision of someone fighting to maintain control. The Witmores have had months to build their case. I'm starting from nothing. Not nothing. Hank pulled a thick folder from behind his back. Miguel spent yesterday in town, asking questions at the bank, the courthouse, places where people remember things. Turns out your husband made quite an impression here in Colorado. Eleanor looked up sharply. David never worked in Colorado. Not worked, but he consulted here back when you were first married. Helped Dr. Martinez set up his large animal practice, advised 3 small ranchers on herd management, donated time to the county fair's agricultural education program. Hank set the folder on the bunk beside her bag. People remember him, Eleanor. They remember his kindness, his dedication to helping small operators who couldn't afford big city veterinary services. Eleanor opened the folder with trembling hands, revealing photographs, newspaper clippings, testimonial letters from ranchers whose animals David had treated during his consulting visits. Her eyes filled with tears as she read accounts of her late husband's generosity, his expertise, his vision for accessible veterinary care. How did Miguel find all this? Miguel knows everyone in 3 counties, Hank said simply. When he explained what you were up against, people started remembering, started talking about how much David's work meant to their operations. Eleanor wiped her eyes, her composure cracking slightly. It won't matter in court. The Witmore's lawyers will argue that sentiment doesn't qualify someone to manage a $40 million trust. Maybe not, but it establishes a pattern of David's intentions, documentation of his commitment to helping small ranchers. That has to count for something. Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of multiple vehicles approaching made them both turn toward the barn entrance. Miguel appeared, his expression grim. "Boss, you need to see this. Looks like half the county's coming up the drive." They walked outside to find a convoy of pickup trucks, horse trailers, and farm vehicles turning into the ranch yard. Doors opened to reveal faces Hank recognized from town, neighbors from adjoining properties, people from the broader ranching community who'd heard about Eleanor's situation through the informal network that connected rural communities. Sarah Jenkins from the general store emerged from the lead truck, carrying a covered dish and wearing the determined expression of a woman on a mission. "Figured you might need some support," she called to Eleanor. "Word gets around." Behind her came Doc Henderson, the veterinarian who'd misdiagnosed the mare Eleanor had treated so successfully. "Heard about your husband's work," he said, extending his hand to Eleanor. "Any woman married to a man like that deserves our respect and our help." Frank Morrison from the Double Diamond Ranch approached with his characteristic gruff directness. "Miguel tells me you're fighting some city lawyers about your daughter's inheritance. That's family business, and family business matters to folks around here." Within an hour, Hank's ranch yard had been transformed into an impromptu community gathering. Tables appeared as if by magic, loaded with casseroles and pies and coffee, strong enough to fuel midnight cattle drives. Conversations sprang up around Eleanor, neighbors sharing stories of times when David's expertise had helped them, ranchers offering testimony about Eleanor's own competence during her month at the Rocking R. "I don't understand," Eleanor said quietly to Hank as they watched the gathering from the porch. "These people barely know me." "They know enough," Hank replied. "They know you're one of us now, and around here, we take care of our own." As the evening progressed, the casual gathering evolved into something more purposeful. Sarah Jenkins, who'd apparently appointed herself coordinator, stood on Hank's porch and called for attention. "Eleanor," she said, her voice carrying across the yard, "we've been talking, and we want you to know something. Every person here tonight is willing to testify at your hearing. We'll tell those lawyers about David's work, about your character, about what it means to have someone fight for the values we care about." A murmur of agreement swept through the gathered crowd. Frank Morrison stepped forward, his weathered face serious. "More than that," he said. "We took up a collection. Nothing fancy, but enough to hire you a proper lawyer, someone who understands what this fight is really about." Eleanor stared at him, clearly overwhelmed. "I can't accept." "You can, and you will," Doc Henderson interrupted. "This isn't charity, girl. This is community taking care of community. Your husband helped people here. You've earned our respect through honest work. That means something." The support was overwhelming, but Hank could see it also carried a weight that Eleanor felt keenly. These people were investing their faith, their time, their limited resources in her battle. The pressure to succeed wasn't just about Sophia's legacy anymore. It was about honoring the trust of an entire community. As the evening wound down and neighbors began loading empty dishes and folding tables, Eleanor found herself standing beside Hank, watching the organized exodus. "I don't know if I can live up to what they expect," she said quietly. "You already have," Hank turned to face her, seeing the woman who'd arrived at his ranch a month ago, transformed by acceptance and purpose. Eleanor, these people don't give their loyalty easily. The fact that they're willing to stand with you says everything about who you really are. And what if I lose? What if the Witmore's lawyers are too good, too well connected? What if I fail everyone who's counting on me? Hank reached into his shirt pocket, feeling the letter he'd written but never delivered. In the lamplight spilling from the house, Eleanor looked beautiful and fragile, and absolutely determined woman, preparing for a battle that would define the rest of her life. "Eleanor," he said carefully, "before you go, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have said weeks ago." She turned to face him fully, her green eyes reflecting the porch light, and something deeper in awareness that they were approaching a moment that would change everything between them. "I know the timing is terrible," Hank continued. "I know you're facing the most important fight of your life, dealing with grief and legal battles and family pressure that would break most people. But I also know that if I don't say this now, I might never get another chance." Eleanor's breath caught, and Hank saw her hands tremble slightly as she seemed to understand what was coming. "I love you," he said simply, "not just for what you've done for this ranch, not just for the competence and grace you bring to everything you touch. I love the woman who sits on my porch at dawn, sharing coffee and comfortable silence. I love the way you listen when I talk about dreams I'd given up on. I love your strength and your vulnerability and the way you've made this house feel like a home again." Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks, but she didn't look away. "Hank, I'm not asking for an answer now," he interrupted gently. "I know you have to fight this battle, have to honor your family's memory. But I want you to know that whatever happens in that courtroom, whatever the Witmores try to do, you have a place here. You have someone who sees you for exactly who you are and loves you for it." Eleanor stepped closer, her hand reaching up to touch his face with infinite gentleness. "I love you too," she whispered. "That's what makes this so hard. For the first time in 2 years, I have something worth fighting for beyond just Sophia's memory." "Then fight for it," Hank said. "Fight for all of it, Sophia's legacy, David's dreams, our future. Fight like the woman I've come to know and love." Eleanor nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. When this is over," Hank agreed, "we'll have all the time in the world to figure out what comes next." But as Eleanor's truck disappeared down the ranch road the next morning, carrying her toward a confrontation that would determine the course of her life, Hank found himself wondering if love would be enough to overcome the forces aligned against them. The letter remained in his pocket, undelivered but no longer unspoken. Whatever happened in that Denver courtroom, Eleanor would face it, knowing she had a home to return to. She chose to claim it. The Denver courthouse felt like a cathedral built to intimidate, its marble floors and soaring ceilings designed to remind visitors of the weight of justice and the power of those who administered it. Eleanor sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded carefully over the worn leather Bible that had belonged to the Witmore family for 4 generations, the same Bible where Sophia's birth had been recorded in careful script, alongside the births and deaths of 6 generations of family members. Across the aisle, the Witmore legal team occupied their table with the casual confidence of people accustomed to winning. Edward and Charles Witmore sat behind their attorneys, their expressions conveying patient certainty that this hearing was merely a formality before regaining control of assets that rightfully belonged to the family business. Eleanor's attorney, Margaret Chenno, relation to the mining company representative who'd visited Hank's ranch, was a Denver family law specialist recommended by the ranchers who'd rallied to Eleanor's cause. She was younger than Eleanor had expected, but her preparation had been thorough, and her understanding of the case's emotional complexities was evident in every question she'd asked during their strategy sessions. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Patricia Lawson entered the courtroom. Judge Lawson was a woman in her 60s, with iron-gray hair and the measured demeanor of someone who'd spent decades weighing competing claims on truth and justice. "We're here today," Judge Lawson began after settling behind the bench, "to determine whether Eleanor Catherine Witmore Bishop should be removed as trustee of the Sophia Grace Bishop Memorial Trust." valued at approximately $40 million, and whether alternative trustees should be appointed to manage these assets. The Witmore attorneys opened with surgical precision, painting Eleanor as a grieving woman whose judgment had been compromised by tragedy. They presented evidence of her abandonment of family responsibilities, her disappearance from corporate obligations, her residence at remote ranches under an assumed name. "Your Honor," lead Witmore attorney James Richardson said with practiced sympathy, "no one questions Mrs. Bishop's love for her deceased daughter or her grief at this profound loss. But grief, however understandable, does not qualify someone to manage assets of this magnitude. The trust requires oversight from individuals with proven business acumen and emotional stability." Richardson presented financial documents showing Eleanor's resignation from corporate boards, her liquidation of personal investments, her apparent abandonment of the sophisticated financial planning that had characterized her pre-tragedy life. "The Witmore family has managed significant assets for 4 generations," Richardson continued. "They possess the infrastructure, expertise, and long-term perspective necessary to ensure that Sophia's legacy generates maximum benefit for the charitable causes specified in the trust documents." Eleanor listened to her life being dissected with clinical detachment, watching the careful presentation of evidence that made her grief appear like instability and her search for healing seem like irresponsibility. When Richardson finished, she felt hollowed out, as if the past 2 years of struggle had been reduced to exhibit numbers and legal terminology. But then Margaret Chen rose to present Eleanor's defense, and the atmosphere in the courtroom began to shift. "Your Honor," Chen began, "the question before this court isn't whether Eleanor Bishop has grieved the loss of her family. The question is whether her actions during that grief demonstrate fitness to honor her daughter's memory and her late husband's values." Chen opened the Witmore family Bible, its leather cover worn smooth by generations of hands, its pages yellow with age, but its gold lettering still clear. "This Bible contains the record of 6 generations of Witmore family history," Chen said, her voice carrying the weight of tradition and legacy. "Births, deaths, marriages, and in the case of Sophia Grace Bishop, a handwritten note dated 3 months before her death." Eleanor's breath caught. She'd forgotten about Sophia's note, written during a Sunday afternoon when her 8-year-old daughter had been playing with the family Bible, carefully copying the formal style she'd seen in older entries. Chen read aloud in clear, measured tones. "Sophia Grace Bishop wishes that when she grows up, her family's money should help children who don't have enough food and animals who are sick and daddy's friends who need help with their ranches because they love their animals but don't have enough money to take care of them properly." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as she remembered that Sunday afternoon, how seriously Sophia had approached her self-appointed task of recording her intentions for the future. How carefully she'd asked David to explain words like resources and allocation because she wanted her note to sound official. "A child's innocent wishes," Richardson objected, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "A child's expression of values learned from parents who dedicated their lives to helping others," Chen countered. "Mrs. Bishop's actions over the past 2 years haven't demonstrated instability, Your Honor. They've demonstrated a commitment to understanding her daughter's wishes at the most fundamental level." Chen presented the folder Miguel had compiled testimonials from Colorado ranchers, photographs of David's volunteer work, documentation of his unpaid consultations with small operators who couldn't afford professional veterinary services. "Eleanor Bishop didn't abandon her responsibilities," Chen said firmly. "She went back to school, so to speak. She learned firsthand about the people her husband served, the communities he loved, the values he and Sophia wanted their legacy to support." The Witmore attorneys exchanged glances that suggested their case wasn't proceeding as smoothly as anticipated. Judge Lawson leaned forward, her attention focused on the evidence being presented. "Mrs. Chen, what evidence do you have that Mrs. Bishop's unconventional approach to trust management would serve the beneficiary's interests better than traditional oversight?" "I'm glad you asked, Your Honor." Chen replied, opening another folder. Because Mrs. Bishop has spent the past month implementing exactly the kind of program her husband and daughter envisioned. Margaret Chen spread a new set of documents across the evidence tableland deeds, partnership agreements, and a comprehensive business plan that Eleanor had worked on during sleepless nights at the ranch, refining David's original vision into something that could honor both his memory and Sophia's innocent wisdom. Your Honor, Chen continued, while living and working at the Rocking R Ranch, Mrs. Bishop identified an opportunity that perfectly embodies her family's values. The ranch was facing foreclosure due to medical debt, exactly the kind of financial crisis that David Bishop's veterinary clinic was designed to address. Eleanor watched Judge Lawson study the documents, noting the careful attention the judge paid to financial projections and implementation timelines. Mrs. Bishop used a portion of her personal assets, not trust funds, to commission geological surveys that revealed significant mineral deposits on the ranch property. Rather than exploit this discovery for personal gain, she developed a partnership model that would allow the ranch to remain in family hands while generating revenue to fund David Bishop's original vision. Chen produced the new ranch deed, signed that morning before the hearing. Eleanor felt her heart swell as she saw Hank's careful signature beside her own, making them equal partners in both the property and the dreams they were building together. The Rocking R partnership, Chen explained, will generate sufficient revenue to establish the David Bishop Veterinary Outreach Foundation, a non-profit organization, providing affordable large animal care to small ranchers throughout the Mountain West region. Exactly what David Bishop died trying to create. Richardson rose quickly, his composure finally cracking. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Mrs. Bishop is using trust assets to fund personal relationships rather than maximizing returns for designated beneficiaries. Actually, Chen replied smoothly, Mrs. Bishop is using personal assets to create sustainable funding for trust beneficiaries. The foundation will be funded through mining revenue, not trust principal, ensuring that Sophia's inheritance remains intact while generating the ongoing charitable impact David and Sophia envisioned. Judge Lawson leaned back in her chair, studying both legal teams with the measured attention of someone accustomed to parsing complex family dynamics. Mr. Richardson, your clients propose to manage the trust through traditional investment strategies. What kind of returns are you projecting? Richardson consulted his notes. Conservative portfolio management should generate 4 to 6% annually, providing approximately $2 million per year for charitable distributions. Mrs. Chen, what are your client's projections for her alternative approach? Chen smiled. The mining partnership should generate approximately $3 million annually after all expenses. Combined with traditional investment of the trust principal, which remains untouched, total charitable distributions would exceed $4 million per year. The mathematics were compelling, but Eleanor knew the real battle wasn't about numbers. It was about who had the right to interpret Sophia's legacy, who understood what David had died trying to accomplish. Edward Witmore rose from his seat behind the attorney's table, his face flushed with frustration. Your Honor, if I may address the court. Mr. Witmore, please remain seated, Judge Lawson said firmly. You'll have an opportunity to speak when called upon. But Edward continued standing, his composure finally breaking after decades of corporate discipline. This woman abandoned her family, her responsibilities, her obligations to the business that has supported 4 generations of Witmores. She's trying to use our granddaughter's memory to justify running away from duties she was born to fulfill. That's enough, Judge Lawson warned, but Eleanor was already rising from her chair. No, Your Honor, Eleanor said quietly. Let him speak. Let him tell this court what he really thinks those obligations were. Judge Lawson hesitated, then nodded. Mr. Witmore, you may speak, but you will address the court, not the parties. Edward straightened his shoulders, channeling the authority that had built a cattle empire. Your Honor, the Witmore family has created thousands of jobs, contributed millions of dollars to local economies, maintained ranching traditions that built the American West. Eleanor's obligations were to continue that legacy, not to abandon everything for some romantic notion of helping individual ranchers. "And David?" Eleanor asked, her voice carrying across the courtroom. "What were his obligations?" David Bishop was a good man who got caught up in idealistic dreams, Charles Witmore added, standing beside his father. The clinic he wanted to build would have failed within 2 years. Small operations can't compete with modern agricultural economics. Eleanor felt something shift inside her note, the desperate grief that had driven her for 2 years, but the quiet strength she'd rediscovered during morning coffee conversations with Hank, working alongside people who understood that some things mattered more than profit margins. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady and sure, "may I present one final piece of evidence?" Judge Lawson nodded, and Eleanor opened the worn leather portfolio she'd carried from the ranch. Inside was a photograph of Sophia, 8 years old and gap-toothed, standing beside a newborn calf she'd helped deliver during one of David's ranch consultations. "This picture was taken 6 months before the accident," Eleanor said, her voice growing stronger with each word. Sophia named this calf Hope because her father had explained that sometimes the difference between a ranch surviving and failing was someone caring enough to help when help was needed most. She faced the Witmores directly. David died trying to build something that would outlast quarterly profit reports. Sophia wrote in the family Bible that she wanted our money to help Daddy's friends who love their animals. They both understood something that 4 generations of Witmore business success somehow missed that true. Legacy isn't measured in assets under management. Eleanor turned back to Judge Lawson. "Your Honor, I'm not asking this court to approve sentiment over sound business practice. I'm asking you to recognize that the most sound business practice is one that honors the values of the people whose memory we're trying to preserve." The courtroom was silent, except for the soft ticking of the wall clock and the distant sound of Denver traffic. Judge Lawson studied the photograph of Sophia and the calf, then looked at the financial projections, then at the faces of everyone whose futures hung in the balance. "I'll have my decision within 48 hours, she said finally. "Court is adjourned." As the gavel fell, Eleanor felt Hank's presence behind her even before she turned. He'd driven through the night to be there for the verdict, and seeing him in the courthouse solid, dependable, loving made her realize that whatever Judge Lawson decided, she'd already won the thing that mattered most. 1 year later, Eleanor Rourke stood on the porch of what had once been just Hank's ranch house, watching the sun rise over land that now bore their joint Brandon R, intertwined with an E, burned into fence posts and cattle hides as a symbol of lives merged and dreams shared. The gold band on her finger caught the early light, new enough to still feel unfamiliar, but precious beyond measure. Judge Lawson's decision had been unequivocal. Eleanor would retain full control of Sophia's trust, with the court's commendation for her innovative approach to honoring her daughter's memory. The David Bishop Veterinary Outreach Foundation had been operating for 8 months now, providing affordable care to small ranchers across 3 states. The mining partnership generated more revenue than projected, ensuring the foundation's work would continue long after Eleanor and Hank were gone. "Coffee's ready," Hank called from the kitchen, his voice carrying the easy affection of a man who'd found love again in the second half of his life. Eleanor joined him at the kitchen table where they'd shared so many morning conversations, but today the space felt different, charged with the anticipation of news they'd been waiting months to share. Her hand moved instinctively to her still flat stomach, protecting the secret that would soon transform their partnership into something even more profound. "Miguel's bringing the new volunteers around this morning," Hank said, scanning the schedule Eleanor had prepared for the Foundation's latest expansion. 3 more veterinary students signed up for the summer internship program. The internship program had been Eleanor's idea, the way to train young veterinarians in the kind of community-focused practice David had envisioned. Students spent summers working with small ranchers, learning that successful veterinary medicine wasn't just about technical skill, but about understanding the economic realities of the people they served. And Sarah called, Eleanor added, sipping her coffee carefully. The county commissioners approved our proposal for the mobile clinic program. We'll have 2 vehicles by fall, equipped to handle routine vaccinations and basic procedures on site. It was exactly what David had dreamed of, a veterinary care that came to the ranchers instead of expecting struggling operations to absorb the cost and time of hauling animals to distant clinics. The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor that it had taken a fortune in rare earth minerals to fund a vision of simple, accessible health care. Through the kitchen window, they watched Miguel leading a group of young people toward the barn veterinary students from Colorado State University, who would spend the summer learning that their profession was as much about human compassion as animal medicine. The sight reminded Eleanor of mornings like this a year ago, when the future had seemed so uncertain. The Witmores sent another letter, Hank said carefully, nodding toward an envelope on the counter. Eleanor smiled, no longer feeling the anxiety such communications had once triggered. Still trying to buy us out? Still trying to buy us out, though the offer's up to 20 million now. Not interested. I know. Just thought you should know they're not giving up. Eleanor rose and moved to the mantel where photographs told the story of their blended life, a wedding picture, with Hank beside the creek where he'd first kissed Martha 40 years ago. Snapshots of foundation work, images of the community that had embraced their vision. In the center sat Sophia's school portrait, her gap-toothed smile, watching over the life her mother had built in her memory. There's something else, Eleanor said, returning to the table where Hank was reviewing foundation financial reports. Something we need to talk about. Hank looked up, noting the careful tone in her voice. Good news or concerning news? Depends on how you feel about sleepless nights and diapers, Eleanor said softly. For a moment, Hank stared at her without comprehension. Then understanding dawned across his weathered features like sunrise over the mesa. You're 12 weeks yesterday. Dr. Martinez confirmed it. Hank's chair scraped against the kitchen floor as he rose to embrace her, his arms gentle but sure around her shoulders. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face note, the desperate grief that had marked so many tears over the past 3 years, but the overwhelming joy of a woman who'd thought such happiness was forever beyond her reach. Are you happy? She asked against his shoulder. Happy doesn't begin to cover it, Hank whispered, amazed, grateful, terrified. But yes, darling, I'm happy. They held each other in the kitchen where their love had first taken root over shared coffee and morning conversations, surrounded by the evidence of lives that had found meaning through loss and purpose through love. Sophia would have been a wonderful big sister, Eleanor said eventually. She would have, Hank agreed, and she'll still be part of this child's life, through the foundation, through the values we're building here. Later that morning, as Foundation volunteers loaded supplies for another day of ranch visits, Eleanor and Hank walked the property boundaries they now shared, legally as well as emotionally. The mineral extraction operation hummed efficiently in the distance. Its revenue-funding dreams neither of them could have imagined when they'd first met over a foreclosure notice and geological surveys. Do you ever regret it? Hank asked as they paused beside the creek where they'd shared so many important conversations. The quiet life you had before all this, the foundation, the business partnerships, the constant activity. Eleanor considered the question seriously, watching Foundation vehicles head out to serve ranchers across the county. I regret that David and Sophia can't see what their dreams became. But regret leaving the ranch life? Never. Even if it means sharing me with veterinary students and Foundation business and community meetings. Eleanor smiled, taking his hand and placing it gently over her stomach. I think there's enough love here to go around, and I think our children, all of them, including the ones we're training and helping, will be better for growing up in a place where love means action, where caring about people translates into doing something meaningful to help them. As they walked back toward the house, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her from desperate grief to cautious hope to profound joy. Sometimes the best things in life really did come, disguised as the worst possible Timinga truth that had begun with her arrival at a failing ranch and a rancher who'd never hired a woman cowboy. But then, Eleanor thought as Hank's arm tightened around her waist, love had always been about taking chances on people who seemed unlikely to fit, but turned out to be exactly what you'd been missing all along. The future stretched before them like open prairie full of possibilities, challenges, and the kind of deep satisfaction that came from work worth doing and love worth keeping.